Working with gradients in Illustrator is great fun because there's so many ways you can use them, and it's very easy to edit and save them as well. Let me select the background in this illustration, and instead of having this flat mint color, I would like to introduce a nice subtle gradient here. Now, to make it easier to see what's happening, first I'm going to turn off the design elements, and we will just see this rectangle on its own. Now there's two different ways you can apply a gradient, actually even more, but these are the two ways that I normally use. You can go to the gradient panel and you can apply a gradient from here. You can pick one of the default gradients, or you can also just click on this slider. That's one of the ways you can start with a gradient. You can also use the gradient tool, which we will come back to. That's G on the keyboard if you want to quickly access it, by the way. And the gradient tool will be very handy. But you can also apply gradients from the swatches. Here you can also find a couple of default gradients you can choose from. But let's stick to the most basic one, the black and white linear gradient. Once this is selected, I go back to the gradient panel and we can see the options available for us. First of all, what we can do is to decide how this gradient should be applied on this shape. Whether we want it linear or radial. Radial looks like this and linear looks like that. No matter what type of gradient you use, you can always reverse the gradient, so change the direction very quickly. But let's just stick to white to black at the moment. Now, the transition from white to black can be controlled with this center point, and that is almost like balancing how much color you want to use. So a bit more of the white or a bit more of the black. That's the midpoint of the transition between these two color stops. They call them color stops, and they can be also changed. You can also call them sliders. So if we double click on it, we can pick a color, and then we can double click on the other one and we can pick another color. Now once again, changing the center point or midpoint can change how much of each color is going to be used in this gradient. And of course, even these sliders can be moved around easily. Below this slider, you can see the exact location of each of these color stops. So there's a percentage there. But you can also control the opacity. So if I reduce it, it will become more see-through. Currently, we are just seeing the white artboard, but it's actually a see-through gradient. And just to prove that to you, if I drag it further up, you can see how it fades into the gray background. I will just undo this, and I will undo the change on opacity as well. Just remember, it's something you can also do to change the opacity of each of the color stops. But the same way as you move the currently available stops, you can also click under the slider to add a new color stop. And by default, it's going to be using exactly the same shade that currently was there in the transition. But then once I double click on it, I can change that also to something else. You can have as many color stops as you want in one gradient. And once you have the colors roughly that you wish to use, I would recommend to switch to the gradient tool, because the rest of the features are easier to use with that. Instead of changing the angle in the gradient panel, what you can do is to click and drag to change the direction and the spread of your gradient. So when you drag just a short line, it's going to be a very abrupt transition. When you stretch it out further, then it's going to be a much smoother gradient. You can of course go beyond the actual shape and in any different angles. And similarly, when you use radial gradients, you will have the same effect, but in a circular way. So in this case, you actually define the radius of your gradient. So you can decide where you want to start it and how far you want to spread it out. With radial gradients, we have an additional option, and that is the aspect ratio. So currently it's a perfect circle, but it can be squeezed into more of an elliptical shape. Now there's a very important thing that you need to remember. If the object you are currently working on is within a group, you can't actually see the gradient annotator tool, which is very useful. So if that ever happens to you, you have to make sure from the layers you select the path itself on which you are applying the gradient and not the group. Once the path is selected, as you can see, also don't forget, don't click on the name, click on the little circle next to it. That's how you highlight an object. So once you have the individual object selected, you will not only see the gradient, but also this thing called Gradient Annotator tool. By the way, it can also be hidden. So if you can't see it, maybe it's because it's hidden. From the view menu, you can find it here, Gradient Annotator, and there's even a shortcut for showing and hiding it. Now, let's just say now we can see it finally. So what can we do with it? Well, first of all, we can very easily reposition it. So instead of redrawing it, I can move it around. In case of a radial gradient, we can squeeze it. So change the aspect ratio of it, just like that. We can also resize it very quickly, make it smaller or bigger. And of course, we can adjust the color stops as well on it. And that's probably the best thing about using this annotator. So we can do it directly on the object itself. Even the midpoints can be adjusted. Plus you can also double click and change the actual colors. You can of course also add new color stops on the annotator and then change the color there. If you don't want to use a color stop anymore, you can just drag it away from the annotator. The same thing applies here as well. If you have a color stop that you don't need anymore, just drag it down. And now let me switch to the linear gradient, where you will see again the same thing. So you have your annotator and you can see all the color stops on it. And of course, you can change the size of the gradient. If you go slightly away from the annotator, you can also change the angle of it very quickly. I just prefer to redraw it, to be honest, in case of a linear gradient. Now, once you have a gradient created that you wish to use, you can also save it as a swatch. And all you have to do is to go to the swatches panel and simply click on the new icon. That's going to create the new gradient swatch. So let me turn back the design that we have here. Now, if I want, I can always switch back to the original color or something similar and then check how it looks with the gradient. And then of course I can keep using the gradient tool, so I can create a different transition from top to bottom or from bottom to top and so on and so forth. So there's many different things you can do once you set up the gradient. Now there's one last thing I would like to mention, and that is you can also use gradients on strokes. Now, just to prove this to you, I'm going to create a circle quickly here. And instead of using a gradient on the fill of this, I'm going to swap the gradient onto the stroke attribute. If you remember, that's the Shift X shortcut. And I'm going to hold down Shift and increase the size of this stroke. So now we can see it being applied here. And to make it easier to see it, I'm just going to drag it away from the actual design itself. So there you go, we have our gradient on the stroke. And in these cases, when the stroke attribute is selected, here in the gradient panel, you can also control how you want the gradient to be applied. And you can see we have three different options. The first one is going to apply the gradient as if the stroke was actually an object. But in these cases, the gradient tool can't be used to change the direction. So you will have to use the angle from the panel. And you won't be able to stretch the gradient beyond the actual boundaries of the object. So it's a little bit more constrained than using a gradient on the fill attribute. But we have two other options as well. We have the apply gradient along the stroke, where there will be a visible start and end point. And then there's the third one as well, where the gradient is going to be applied from center out or from the outside in, depending on how you look at it. So this is what we call across the stroke. The first one was within the stroke. And the second one in the middle is called along the stroke. So let's just see these side by side, just so it's a little bit easier to memorize. I'm going to create three versions and I will apply them in the order we have it here in the gradient panel. So that is within stroke. The second is along stroke, and the third one is across the stroke. And I'm going to increase the stroke a little bit even more just so we can have a really good look at it. And you can imagine that there's a lot of possibilities once you start working with gradients. We are going to keep using them in the following chapters, but in the next video, we will talk about a very important panel, the appearance panel, where we can not only keep track of all the changes to the appearance of objects, but also create much more complex combinations of using multiple strokes and fills and even effects. In this video, I'm going to talk about the appearance panel. You might remember it, we placed it here on the right side in an earlier chapter, and I promise to you that it's going to be a very useful panel. That's exactly what I'm going to prove to you this time. So at first, it might seem like an unnecessary duplication of all the settings that you have from the options bar, but actually the appearance panel can do a lot more than that. Let's just try it with a simple shape. So I'm going to create a square just to start with. And you will see here in the appearance panel that we have the fill color available, which we can change easily. And we can also apply a stroke color, just like that, and also increase the size of it. Let me move this shape closer so we can keep an eye on both of these parts at the same time. That's not much new because we've already been able to do this before. But what's the whole point of the appearance panel is that you can have multiple strokes and fills on the same shape. And that's when it becomes important to keep an eye on this panel. So let's give it quickly a second stroke. That's the option here at the bottom, add new stroke. So the first icon there. And as soon as I change the color and change the size of it, we should be able to see both strokes. Why don't I see the other stroke right now? Well, it is because there is an order between these attributes and whatever is on top is closest to you. So if I move this one, which is a bigger stroke, underneath the other one, we should be able to see both of them at the same time. Let me just make this even bigger and maybe change the color of it to something that's obviously different. So now if we have a look at this shape, we can see that we have two strokes and one fill color on it. I would be able to continue doing the same thing. Again, I'm going to create another stroke, maybe set this one up to white, and let's just reduce the size of it slightly. So now we actually have 3 strokes and 1 fill. But we could even have multiple fills. So let me select the fill and click on this new fill icon here at the bottom. That will add an additional fill color. And why not use a gradient? Let's use this black and white gradient. And while we are at it, I would like to show you also that you can change not only what swatch you want to use on a fill color or on a stroke, but also you can amend the opacity of it. So if you click on opacity, you can control how strong that will be, but you can also change the blend mode. And I'm just going to choose multiply, which will blend the gradient, the black and white gradient, onto the color that was used underneath, which is this blue color. So let's just recap. Now we have 3 strokes and 2 fills. The best thing about the appearance panel is that we can turn these strokes one by one on and off, and also the fill colors can be turned on and off. So all of these attributes are making up the appearance of this object. Every attribute is editable, and you can even change the order of them. So for example, if I want, I can drag this black stroke on top, which then will cover all the other strokes because that's the biggest one. But as soon as I make it smaller, so let me just go down in size, maybe down to 3, then immediately the order of the strokes changed. It is important to remember to keep the object selected on which you are working. If the appearance panel says no selection here on the top, that means you currently don't have anything selected. So it doesn't matter what you change on these values, it won't update on the object. You have to make sure the object selected, and then it should say something else apart from no selection, like path or group, and so on and so forth. Coming back to the second field that I added, When you open up the actual attribute, you can see that it's using a multiply blend mode. Now this is something I just quickly applied, but let me show this once again to you. We have the normal mode, which is the default option, and then we have all these other blend modes here, out of which I most of the time use multiply, which really nicely blends the current colors onto the color underneath. So look at this. If I change the color underneath, that gradient is still going to be visible on top of this. Now once you set up an appearance that you might want to use again on another object, you can save it as a graphic style, what you will find here in this panel. And all you have to do is, while the object is selected, click on this new graphic style icon. That will save it. And then whatever you add, let's just add maybe a star shape, we will be able to apply that graphic style on it straight away, as easily as that. When you look at the graphic styles panel, and let me just drag this out for a bit, just so we can see it better. So looking at this, we will be able to choose a couple of default graphic styles, like that one called Bevel Soft. We can also find Dusk, which is a quite nice one. And then we have also these other graphic styles that are using patterns. That's not all the default options that you can choose from, because here in the libraries we can find sets of other graphic styles as well. Like, let's try the Illuminate styles and pick one of these. Once you select a style, it will be added into your graphic styles library. And the best thing about them is that once you use a graphic style, you can actually see all those attributes that makes up the appearance here in the appearance panel. So we can find all the fill colors and also all the strokes that they used for this design. It is almost like a way to reverse engineer how they actually created a certain style. Let me switch back to the way we created our style, and let me show you one additional feature. I am going to select the black stroke which is on top, and I will show you another great technique that again is best done through the appearance panel. Here at the bottom we have an FX icon. These are all the effects from which you can choose any, but for now I'm just going to start with a simple one. Under Stylize, I will choose Scribble. This is an Illustrator effect, and once I turn on preview, you will see it already being used here. But let's just increase the variation a bit just so we can see how it works. Maybe the curviness as well, the path overlap, something like that. Increase spacing slightly just so it's more visible. And when I click OK, you will see that now, if I zoom closer, this shape is not the way it used to look, because now that stroke has an effect on it as well. When I open up the stroke attribute, I can see that scribble effect inside. I can turn it off, turn it back on, and I can also click on it to bring up the options that I had. These effects are called dynamic effects or live effects, which means that they can always be changed and updated. You can even swap the effect between the strokes. So if I open all the 3 strokes I have, I can drag this scribble effect onto the red stroke, or again onto the white stroke, and so on and so forth. I could also copy the effect by holding down the Alt key and dragging it over to another attribute. Now I have the same effect on both of these strokes, the black and the red one as well. So now that we know how it works, let's put this to use. And I'm going to create a new graphic style. What I will build is a style that I can use to draw roads. I'm going to just put this star on the side, maybe even out of the artboard. That's what I do sometimes when I want to clear up my artboard, but I'm not sure whether I need an object or not. I just put it on the side. You can of course draw anything outside of your artboard. The only disadvantage of that is that you won't be able to export those elements. But coming back here, I am going to use the line tool and just draw a straight line holding down the shift key. Now I am going to add another stroke, and I will change the stroke color to a darker gray value, something like that. I will also increase the size of that, and then I will change the stroke in the middle to orange. I will also increase the size slightly. And then before I do anything else, let me just move this closer so we can see it better. So once I increase the stroke size, I can now click on the stroke value and choose dashed line. Maybe I reduce the size slightly, and I will also change the gap size to something a little bit less than that, what we can see currently. And also I will reduce the dash size, something like that. Maybe the gap can be a little bit more. Okay, that looks quite good, but let's add another stroke again. So the third stroke value at the bottom, I'm going to increase slightly again, and I will also change the color on it, maybe to red. Or let's just use a brighter gray, something like that. Let's increase it a little bit further up. All right, now we have this design ready, which can be used easily to draw roads, right? So we have 3 strokes only. That's the only thing I did here. We have the center line, we have the stroke, which is the actual concrete, and then we have a pavement or something similar to that. But currently, it's still not really convincing. I mean, I think I can do this even better. So let's just put this here on the side, and let's just add a little bit more finesse or refinement to this. Let's select the stroke at the bottom and increase the size of it. So let's just increase that pavement a bit more. Then I'm going to add another stroke on top of that, and I will make it maybe completely dark or much darker than the previous one. I will keep it the same size, but I'm going to use dashed line on it, and I'm going to remove the gap first of all, and I'm going to increase or actually decrease the dashes. So something very narrow, like 1 point. Then I can add a much longer gap, something like that, and immediately it starts to look like tiles on the sidewalk. Let me reduce the size of the center line a bit, and instead I will also add lines on the sides of the road. For that, I am going to click on New Stroke, and I will increase the size of it close to the size of the actual concrete, like that. I will also remove the dashed line from it, and then I just move it underneath the other stroke. Now all I need to do is to just reduce slightly the size of the actual pavement color, and immediately we have also paint on the edges of the concrete. I can also make the color of this white, and if I want it to be very precise, I could even add another stroke, move it behind this white stroke, and increase the size of that slightly beyond the white stroke. So we have also an extra line there next to it. The line in the middle needs to be slightly brighter than this. So I shift click on the color and increase the brightness of it a bit. Around there, I think that looks a little bit better. And now we can save this as a graphic style. So remember, all you need to do is to save it as a graphic style, which you can do here in this panel, and click on New Graphic Style. Now that is great, it's now saved. So we can even delete this object and the star as well, we don't need them anymore. Let's come back to the artboard and let me show you what I prepared here. I'm going to turn on these 2 layers and voila, there's a little city. Now we just need roads. You have this exercise file, so you can build your own streets once you create this same graphic style that I just showed you. And I would recommend to use the following tool. There is a tool here called Pencil tool. The shortcut for it is N. And we are going to learn more about this in the next chapter. But for now, all I want you to do is to draw a line with that tool. Once you have your line, you will be able to apply the graphic style. Just choose the one that we saved, and there you go, there's the street. The good thing about the pencil tool is that it can be set up in a way that you can continue drawing existing shapes. As you can see, I can draw over this road a couple of times until it gets into the direction that I wanted it to work with. So I'm just going to continue drawing it, and there is going to go through. Then I can start another road, and once again just choose the graphic style that we used earlier. You can have always turns in the streets, and you can even overlap them on each other, just like that. If you want to make sure that your pencil works the same way as it does on my computer, you just have to double click on it and make sure that you have the edit selected paths and keep selected options enabled. As I said, I will come back to these features later and I will explain it in more detail, but for now we can have a look at our city that we designed and enjoy how quickly we can continue adding more streets, again just using the graphic style and the pencil tool. Once again, I can just move this slightly away, just like that.